Microsoft SQL Server can be a scary place. All this technology and terminology surrounding what really should be a simple topic, storing and retrieving data. The thing is, the corporate world connects Microsoft SQL Server to C# a lot. That means if you want to learn C# to use in the business world, you should know Microsoft SQL as well. One of the features of SQL I tend to talk about a lot is stored procedures. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to what a stored procedure is and how to build one. But that isn't even the most important part of this video. I'm going to cover why you should use stored procedures and how they can make your database move to the next level. For those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Tim Corey, and my goal is to make learning C# and other related languages as easy as possible for you. If that sounds good to you, hit the subscribe button. If you want to go further, join my mailing list by clicking the link in the description below. That's where you get insider information and discounts on my courses. Now let's jump right into SQL. Here I'm using the latest version of SQL Server Management Studio, which is version 17.1, against a 2016 version of the SQL Server Developer Edition. Now, all of this is free. Developer Edition is free, and SQL Server Management Studio is free. Now, I've got a database here called Samples. Inside the Samples database, we have just one table, the dbo.people table. Inside this table, it's really simple. I just have 8 records, and they are just first name and last name, and of course an ID as well. So that's all we have in this database right now. Just one table, 8 records, really simple. So let's start by creating a new stored procedure, and then we'll talk through what exactly it is. Now I could do it right here, and I will do it right here inside of a query window. But if you want to, you can go to Programmability, expand up, and say Store Procedures right here. Inside here you'll see that I have a whole bunch of system stored procedures, but no actual stored procedures, none that are mine. Now, system stored procedures come from Microsoft. So these are Microsoft provided, and there's a lot of them. This video is not going to go into what all these are, but there's an awful lot of tools in here to help you with your database. Okay, there's an awful lot of tools in here that'll help you do different things. But for now, we're going to concentrate just on user-created stored procedures. So there's none right now, and we could say right-click on Stored Procedure and say New Stored Procedure, and it creates a template for us. That template's kind of nice. I especially like this right here because it reminds you to comment on your stored procedure what exactly this is, who created it, and when. That's really helpful. So with this template, you can just fill in the different parts. However, we're going to start from scratch. So we'll leave it open just so we can see it and reference it, but we'll come over here to this blank query window. Now, what is a stored procedure? A stored procedure is simply a precompiled bit of code. So for example, normally we might say something like this: select star from dbo.people. That's a pretty standard, pretty simple query. And if you run that, you get these 8 people. So this is a standard query. It'd be one that would be dynamic or easily changed. Now, if you put something like this inside your C# code, that can be a problem, because what if you specify the columns? Specified ID, first name, and last name. All right, so this is what you specify, which is a good thing to do instead of star. So if you specify these 3 columns and later I add a 4th column for email, you wouldn't have that in your code. So you'd have to go over to your C# code, open it up, make the change, and then recompile if you wanted to have that in your code. So, but that's not really a big reason why you shouldn't have this in your code. And we'll get into the reasons why you would do a stored procedure over this later on. But for now, let's look at how you do something similar in a stored procedure. So let's cut this out. We'll actually take away our window down below. And instead we're going to say create procedure, DBO, that's the owner, which by default it's DBO. Notice over here for the table, it's DBO.people. That's the owner of the table. So DBO dot, and that's a namespace. And we'll call this SP people underscore get all. Now, I'm starting with an SP to indicate that's a stored procedure versus no prefix for just a table. So my way of doing things is just to say SP. But what you do not want to do is you do not want to say SP underscore. And the reason why is because SP underscore is actually a reserved prefix. And that's reserved for system level stored procedures. Stored procedures that can be accessed from any database. And so we don't want to use that prefix. We don't want to step on toes for a database specific stored procedure. So a key takeaway there is don't start with SP underscore. SP is fine though. So SP people underscore get all. And this is the way I name my stored procedures. I start with an SP to indicate the stored procedure. Then I give it the table name of the primary table in question. And I say primary because you can have two or more tables that you might be working with. But in this case, it's the people table. So therefore, SP people, and then I have an underscore and what it does. In this case, it's going to get all the records from the people table. So now I say as begin, and then I'll do my actual my actual call. So select ID, first name and last name from DBO people, and then at the end I will say end. And that is my create procedure statement. This creates a stored procedure. So it's the same statement. That's the statement right there. It just wraps it in this create procedure. So let's call this to actually create the stored procedure. Now command's completed successfully, and if we refresh down here, we'll see I have dbo.sppeople underscore gets all now. So now if I were going to create a new query window inside of samples database, I could say exec dbo.sppeople underscore get all. Now it's going to yell at me because it says I don't know what that stored procedure is. But if I do a Control-Shift-R, it will refresh the cache of what items are available. And now it says, okay, I know what that is. So calling a stored procedure is a little bit different than calling the actual code. So instead of saying select from, we just say execute, or exec, dbo dot, and the name of the stored procedure. So let's run this. Notice it returns the same number of records. It returns the same values, everything. So what's the difference between a stored procedure and a direct call? Well, this direct call right here has to be compiled and then run. Now, Microsoft SQL Server is getting more and more intelligent about how to compile these quickly and how to remember even a dynamic SQL statement like this in memory so it's compiled if it's called multiple times. But a stored procedure is always compiled. And so if you're going to call this, it will be a little bit more efficient to call a stored procedure than it will be to call a dynamic SQL statement the first time. And again, we'll cover more of the benefits and drawbacks near the end of this video, but I want to just point out a couple of those right now. Now, in our stored procedure, it may not be obvious, but down here in our messages, it says 8 rows affected. That's actually a second set of data that's returned with this stored procedure. Now, often we don't need that. In fact, most of the time we don't need that. And so, even in the template, by default, it adds this statement right here. set no count on. That's not something we did here. So we're going to add that so we don't return the number of rows affected. So let's change our store procedure and say set no count on. Now I can't do a create here because I've already created this store procedure, but I can do an alter. If you do an alter procedure, what it does is it changes the store procedure to this new value or this new setup. So let's execute this. And now if I come back over here and execute this again, it returns all 8 statements like before. In the messages, it says command completed successfully. It doesn't give me the count or the number of rows that have been affected. So that makes the call just that little bit more efficient, and it helps not mess up your code when it's asking for a set of data and you're getting a set of data and rows affected. All right, so now let's look at creating another store procedure. It's going to close out the template, and I will close this out as well, but I'll create a new query window. I always like a few extra lines in my initial window. So let's say create procedure dbo.sp people _ get by last name. And we'll set it first the same way as begin select ID first name last name from dbo.people, and then we're going to do an end here. Now I want to limit this by last name. So I'm going to say, what's the last name that I want to limit it by? And that's where we pass in a variable. At last name, and then the type. So at last name, nvarchar 50. Because that's the length of my field. And if you don't know the length of your field, you can go to people, columns, see that last name is an nvarchar 50. So I'm passing in a Unicode variable length character string. I'm going to call it last name. And so in here I can say where last name, the field, so the field in dbo.people, equals last name, at last name, which is the value being passed in. So this is a variable. So given the variable's name, and it has to start with the at symbol, and then I give it the variable type, which in this case is a Unicode variable length character, or a string essentially, with a maximum length of 50 characters. So now that I have this variable populated, I can use it to limit my query, in this case where last name equals and the passed in value. Put my semicolon at the end. Let's create that store procedure, and now I can call this. So let's do Control-Shift-R, and I'll comment out this one just so I don't accidentally hit F5 and run it as well. exec dbo.sp people _ get by last name. But then it says, you know what? You can't do that yet because it expects the parameter last name, which was not supplied. Now I could say at last name equals like so, and that will work. But if I'm going to pass in all the parameters and I'll pass them in order, then I don't have to specify the name. I can just pass in the actual value. So in this case it says there's only one parameter, so the first value being passed in, that goes in that parameter. So let's run this, and notice my list is now 4 people long: Tim, John, Chris, and Maggie, Corey. So I've limited my list based upon last name, which was passed in as a variable. Now, if I wanted to, I could pass in more than one variable. So for example, let's alter this, and we'll actually pass in a first name as well. So I put a comma after my last name and the type. And the next line I'll put first name and varchar 50. Now usually I'd probably put first name then last name, but I'm assuming this store procedure is already in place, in which case I wouldn't want to mess up the order. Because remember I said it comes in order. So if I had said, you know what, I want first name first and then last name, and I already had existing calls out there that were calling this store procedure, that would put Corey in the first name instead of the last name. And that'd be a problem. So let's alter that. We'll run it. And now, if we do a Control-Shift-R, it's going to yell at us and say, you need the first name parameter. So I'll say Tim. And now if I run this, it doesn't do anything different. And the reason why, I didn't actually use the first name variable, but it still took both values. So now I could say where last name equals last name and first name equals first name. We could even do a little bit of indentation here just to make it a little nicer. We can alter that. And now if we run this, we get one value back. So that's the basics really of a store procedure. You have the initial line, which either create or alter, and it specifies the name. And then you have right below that name, you have your variables separated by comma. If you want to do a default value, you can, just equals the default value. Then you have your as statement and a begin and end. And everything between the begin and the end will get executed. So this is the actual statement. Now, that means that your store procedure can be a insert, a delete, an update, a join, a select. All those things can happen inside your store procedure. In fact, you can have multiple things happen inside your store procedure. You can do both an insert and delete. Think about a bank transaction. Say you're transferring money from a savings account to a checking account. Well, in the bank transaction, what would happen is it would remove it from your savings account and it would add it to your checking account all in one transaction. So that might happen inside of one store procedure. So they're not limited to just one call. Now here's the other nice thing about a store procedure, and that's that it's a one transaction. Meaning that you can say this transaction has to fully happen or I roll it back. And we're not going to get into transactions in this video, but essentially what you do is start right here and say begin trans, and then you have to complete the transaction, and so on. Now what that does is it allows you to say the whole thing has to happen as one chunk. Think again back to that bank example. What if the store procedure crashed halfway through that process? It's removed the money from your savings account, but then it crashes before it puts it into your checking account. You wouldn't want your money to disappear. A store procedure allows you to have that transaction, that atomic level transaction, happen in one place. You can do it in code, but the risks of problems are much, much higher. So another great benefit of a store procedure. So that's really all there is to creating store procedures. So far I've created two. We've got the get all and also the get by last name, which is kind of a misnomer now because we have get by last name, but it asks for last and first name. But oh well, not a big deal. So that shows us how to do a store procedure. But let's talk about some of the benefits of doing store procedures. And the very first benefit I want to talk about is security. And this is one that a lot of people miss. So if I have access, let's close this out. If I have access to do this, and let's run that. So here I have these 8 records. I just done a select star from people. Well, what if there was a social security number or a credit card number or something else sensitive in one of these columns? Well, if I have access to all the columns in dbo.people, I can see all those columns. Now, a lot of people say that a login to a database should essentially be an administrator, and they create all their logins with administrative level access. That's a problem. Now, the next thing they do is say, well, I'll only allow them to have access to certain tables. Well, that's great, but whatever they have access to, they have full access to usually. Because if you want to allow the application they use to insert data, you have to allow them to insert data using the login. So essentially, if they're using an application, unless you take great pains, and even so, it's kind of iffy if you can do this. If they use the application and that the permissions of that user that talks to the database, if they use those same permissions in SQL Server Management Studio, they can do a lot of stuff. Essentially the same stuff the application can do. Now the application may say, you can't delete this record because of this business rule. In SQL Server Management Studio, that business rule doesn't exist. Therefore, you can go ahead and delete that user. There have been a number of times that I've used an application where I couldn't do something because it was locked down, but I really needed to do it. So I use those same permissions to get into SQL Server Management Studio and go ahead and do that action. Now, I wasn't being malicious, but those permissions really gave me more access than the designers originally intended for me to have. So that's why I'm not a big fan of giving out credentials that have all this access. In fact, I don't like people to even see what tables are available or what data is in those tables. I don't like them to even have read access to my tables. Now the question is, how do you do that and yet still give them access to use your application? And this is why I love store procedures. And this is why I default to using store procedures first before I move away from them. So let's start by creating a new role for the database. Now, if you're not familiar with database security, I'll try and walk you through it in the simplest terms possible. But the reality is you don't need to know a whole lot about security in order to really lock down your database. So let's start by creating a database role. Now, a role it's a name for essentially kind of like a group where you say these permissions are given to this role. And then anyone that has that role has those permissions. So for example, a role might be delete users. And then that role has access to delete from specific tables. Then you could say Tim has the role delete users, which means that Tim can delete from these specific tables. So let's create a new role for us to use. And it's really simple, create role. Now a role is specific to a database, or at least in this case it is. We're not going to do a server role, we're going to do a database role. So create role, and if you notice down here in the security, you'll see roles, and you'll see DB underscore, and then a name, data writer, DDL admin, deny data writer, and all the rest. These are the standard roles. So I'm going to create a role. I'm going to call it DB stored procedure only access. And I won't do DB underscore, the same kind of principle as the SP underscore. I just don't want to have that habit. And I also know now that this is my role, not a role given to me by Microsoft. So now I can just hit the execute button, and that creates that role. If we come down here to database roles and hit the refresh button, we'll see that I have the DB stored procedure, and I call it store, not stored. Oops. There we go. I'll create a new role, and I'll delete that old row. So I'll right click and say delete, hit OK, and now we have DB stored procedure only access. So now that I have this role, I can now say grant execute to and that role name. So this grant right here is saying I'm going to give you something, give you access to something. In this case, I'm going to give you the execute action to this role, meaning this role will now be able to execute. Remember that when we call the store procedure, we said exec and then the store procedure name. So as execute, that's the permission we're giving it. And I run that, and command completed successfully. So now that role, the DB store procedure only access role, allows a user to call the stored procedures. So now what we need to do is come down to our server, not the database users, but the server users. So under security for server, logins, I'm going to right click and say new login. I'm going to call this login Bill. Now, if you're not familiar with creating users, I essentially have two methods for creating a user. One is Windows authentication. So I'm currently logged in under the name Tim. So if I were to do a search for Tim, I would find that user and I could use Windows authentication. Meaning, if I'm logged into Windows, then I will have access to the SQL Server. I don't want to do that. I want to create a login that is SQL specific, meaning using the SQL Server authentication, not Windows. So I'll say Bill, the password, I'll say is Bill as well, which actually is a bad password. It's a bad login and password combination. But I'm going to uncheck the box that says enforce password policy, meaning the password won't expire and I'm not going to have the requirements of an uppercase and a lowercase letter and a number and a special character or in a certain length. So I'm not going to do any of those. I'm going with login and password, both of Bill. Come down here to server roles, nothing, just let it be public. User mapping, in the samples database, I'm going to check the box that says DB stored procedure only access. So I'm going to apply that role to this account. So now Bill will have that stored procedure only access. And I hit OK. So now let's close out. So I'm going to disconnect from this server and reconnect. I'll close this out as well. I'm going to reconnect, but instead of logging in with Windows authentication, which is what I do, my Tim login has admin permission to this server. Instead, I'm going to log in with SQL Server authentication. Login name is Bill, password is Bill. I hit OK. I go to databases, open up a samples database, and look at the tables. Notice there's no tables in this list. Let's go to store procedures. I see 2 store procedures. So let's open up a new query window. And I'm going to try and first of all cheat the system. I know that there is a table called people. So I'm going to say select star from dbo.people. IntelliSense doesn't work, but no big deal. Hit F5 and it says select permission was denied on the object people. So I don't have access to read the people table. In fact, I can't even see it. But let's do this instead. exec dbo.sp people _get all. There are all the people. I could also do exec dbo.sp people get by last name, pass in Corey and a first name of John, and I will run this. Let's highlight just that one, and I get just John Corey back. So I can run these store procedures, but I don't have access to do things like this. Delete from dbo.people. Nope, can't do it. So you see the power here? With just a couple of commands, the create role and grant execute to that role, and then applying that role to a user, I have said that this user, the user Bill, can only call store procedures. That means that Bill can't do anything except what I've explicitly said he can do. So he can't delete rows, he can't insert rows, he can't update rows, he can't do filtering by only first name. All he can do is whatever store procedures I've already granted him to do. Now that execute role allows me to say that he can do any store procedure. So if it's a store procedure in this list, Bill can do it. So if I had a store procedure that said sp people _ delete all, and it deleted every row from the people table, Bill could run that. So if you want to be more granular, instead of giving that grant execute to, you could specify only certain store procedures that are granted to execute to. So you could say only these store procedures can Bill access, or can this role can access. So you can get really granular if you want, but right out of the gate, with 2 lines of code, create role and grant execute to. With those 2 lines of code, you've created a role that locks down your database to only what you've allowed people to do. So that, in my mind, is a really compelling reason to use store procedures. Because if you use only store procedures to access, update, and delete data, then you can lock your database down very, very simply, very quickly, and yet fully, to the point where they can't even see which tables are available. So that's a big benefit in my mind. Store procedures are also faster than writing select star as far as executing inside of SQL Server. Not all the time. Sometimes they're just as fast if it has stored that same select statement. But in general, store procedures are faster. The other thing that store procedures, the other benefit of store procedures is they're clearly defined. You know exactly what's going to happen at the SQL level because it's defined exactly what's going to happen. And one more bit of security that comes along with store procedures is the lessened possibility of a SQL injection attack. It's not a complete security, but it's much, much safer to use a store procedure when it comes to protecting against SQL injection attack. So at this point, you've seen a lot of the benefits of store procedures. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And you've also kind of heard my view on why I use store procedures. The security, the speed, the reusability, clearly defined, protection against SQL Server injection attacks, and all the rest. But you will hear some drawbacks to store procedures. So I'm going to cover them and at least talk to you about them, and then you can decide if the drawbacks are worth it. So the first drawback is probably the one that affects me the most, the one that I wish had a better story than it does, and that is this. Store procedures are not under source control. Your C# code, you can put in Git, and then you can say it's versioned and it's under source control, and you can have different branches. You can have all this stuff around protecting your code and making sure your code is discoverable and making sure you have copies of the older versions of your code and all the rest of stuff that that, source control provides. but there's not a similar thing for SQL Server. There's not get for SQL Server. Well, at least not really. Now, there is a paid option you can do, and that is from Redgate. And if you can afford it, it's a great option. Redgate provides the ability to have source control right in your database. It's really powerful, it's really easy to use, and it kind of works in the same flow. Now, the hard part here is databases are radically different than code. And so there are some quirks that come along with this. So that's one option, but it's not cheap. It's a little expensive. Another option that'd be a little bit cheaper and also has more features to it would be go the route like the SQL Examiner suite. SQL Examiner will take a different approach to source control, and that is it does differences between your database and, say, your development database, or your development database and your production database. And it says, here's the changes that have happened, and it creates a script for you. And you can actually lock that script into your source control and run it from the SQL Examiner suite. So it's a little cheaper. It's a little more full features because it does more than just source control. It actually does some comparison. It even does data comparison. And it creates some great statements that allow you to recreate the changes in a new database. And the reality is you shouldn't be making live changes on your production server. In fact, you probably shouldn't be making live changes on your staging or even development server. Instead, make your changes on your local database and then start that process early of committing your code and replicating it to your development database and then on through to your production database. So there are ways to do source control well with SQL Server. It's not the same, and it's not the great story we have with C# or other programming languages where source control is just a natural part of the process, but it can be done. It can fit well into your deployment process, and it can work with some of these third-party tools or even just manually. The next drawback that I hear a lot is one that I have a little bit of a fundamental conflict on, and that is this. Business logic doesn't belong in the database. The database's job is to store data. You shouldn't have logic in your database. And I really don't agree with this. And here's why. I see these store procedures down here really as the user interface to my database. So I do allow the idea that business logic could be in these store procedures. Now, I don't include a ton, but I do like the idea of checking the data before it goes in the database. I don't like the idea of trusting anyone. When we talk about creating user interfaces in C#, one of my tenets that I always talk about is don't trust the user. If you give them a first name field, they're going to put in their age. They're going to put in nothing. They're going to put in a book of information. Whatever it is that's going to be wrong, they're going to try it. Not necessarily maliciously, just because end users do wacky things that I don't expect. In the same way, why would I trust an application? Why would I trust that only an application is talking to my database? Again, let's come back to our execute only with the store procedures. If I didn't have that and someone ran this code right here, right in SSMS, it would work. They could drop or delete all the people from the people table. That doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy. So I do want to have some sort of protection against that. That would technically be called business logic. I'm okay with that. If you're familiar with building websites, especially JavaScript-powered websites, we have the idea of front-end validation, meaning In jQuery, we have the jQuery validate, or with other tools, we have other ways of validating. But essentially, if you have a form and you say for first name, you filled nothing out, and you hit submit, before it actually submits, it's going to say, nope, you can't even submit because you haven't put something in that first name field. That is client-side or front-end validation. The JavaScript is saying you can't even talk to the backend yet because you've not given me the right information. However, once you give the right information and JavaScript says, yes, that's valid data, and you hit submit, the backend does validation as well. And the reason why is because the backend can't trust the front end. Because you can bypass JavaScript and you could call the form directly instead of calling it through the front end form. And there's a lot of ways of getting around that front end validation. And so we actually do validation twice, especially in ASP.NET MVC. So we do validation on the JavaScript side, and then we pass data in, we do validation again. And then we do something with it because we know that data is valid. Well, in the same way, I kind of want to do some validation again when you send data to the database because I can't trust that your application fully validated the data. And I can't trust that it's an application that's sending me the data. So that's why I kind of push back on that idea of no business logic in the database. And the last drawback I hear sometimes is that tools like Entity Framework and other large ORMs don't like to use store procedures. They can, they don't like to. They like writing their own select and insert and update statements. And here's my deal. I really push back on the idea of using Entity Framework. If you've watched my other videos, you'll see that I really don't like Entity Framework. Now, it's a really amazing tool. Microsoft's done some amazing things with it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't allow me to secure my database. It's slow, and it writes the SQL for me instead of allowing me to specify exactly what I want in my SQL. Now, it does save a step in that you're not coming over here to SSMS and writing queries, but the drawback there is you've got this black box of I ask for data and it comes until it doesn't. Once it doesn't, I've got a problem I got to debug. So Entity Framework adds a lot of complexity, and it slows things down tremendously, and it doesn't allow me to secure my database the way I want. So that's why I don't really care that you can't use Entity Framework to its full potential with this method. Now, you could use Entity Framework still, just doing only store procedures, but there's not really a benefit there. So those are the drawbacks. Source control story isn't great. Business logic in the database, if that's a concern for you, it's not for me. And again, not really a good story for Entity Framework, but personally, I am okay with that. So those are the drawbacks. The benefits, they're fast, they're reusable, they're clearly defined, they're safer when it comes to SQL injection, and it's much, much more securable from a database perspective. So those are store procedures. I think it's a really compelling reason to use them, and I think they're actually pretty simple to do. But I'd love to hear your feedback on, have you used them? What do you think? Have you seen any other benefits or drawbacks that you'd like to talk about? Or if you have any other questions. So leave all those questions and comments down below. I'll try to answer every single one that you post. Don't forget, if you haven't already, I'd love a thumbs up for this video and also subscribe. Thanks. Have a great day.